Senator Miville-Dechêne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise as the friendly critic of Bill S-235, sponsored by my colleague, Senator Sama Atulajan, a bill on the national strategy to combat human trafficking. Human trafficking is a scourge, a crime that is difficult to identify because it often takes place behind closed doors, and because every effort is made to conceal the schemes to exploit young women and girls for sexual purposes, as well as illegal workers recruited abroad and underpaid on the black market in industrial, service, or agricultural businesses. It is therefore difficult to prove. In the cases of trafficking for sexual exploitation, traffickers recruit victims by showering them with gifts, making promises, and controlling them through violent tactics. It is the most common form of trafficking in Canada, and the number of trafficking cases reported to the police has been rising for the past 10 years. In January, the government appointed its first chief advisor on human trafficking, Ms. Jennifer Richardson, herself a survivor, who has worked very closely with indigenous communities. Unfortunately, Ms. Richardson left her position last December after less than a year on the job. That concerns me. What happened? Why has there been no replacement? Is the government serious about its efforts to combat human trafficking? I look forward to reading Ms. Richardson's latest yet unpublished report on, as well as her recommendations. It is very difficult to ascertain the actual results of this federal strategy. It is therefore clear that more pressure needs to be put on the system. As co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on modern slavery and human trafficking, I was one of those who met with Councillor Richardson. She had a huge challenge, making her voice heard within the government. This strong woman was only beginning to get to grips with this difficult task of motivating and bringing together all stakeholders in fighting human trafficking. And there are many of them: Public Safety Canada, the Canadian Border Services Agency, the Financial Transactions and Reports and Analysis Centre of Canada, Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, Public Services and Procurement Canada, and finally, Women and Gender Equality Canada. So 6 departments, a huge challenge. She recently embarked on a tour of the provinces and NGOs who are doing the groundwork. To ensure that this does not end up in a bureaucratic quagmire, Bill S-235 proposes this national strategy, prioritizes victims of trafficking, notably by following through a long-term commitment, the creation of a Survivors Advisory Committee. The survivors that I've met have been calling for years to establish this committee, as they feel that their voices are not being heard or are given little recognition, or that decisions are made without properly consulting the victims. Another key element of the bill is that it requires the responsible minister to conduct a review of the national strategy to combat human trafficking every 5 years and table that report in the House. Such a review should be accompanied by public consultation with stakeholders, especially those with lived experience of trafficking. As my colleague Senator Atulajan has said, it must also consult provincial governments who have initiatives in this area. Without a serious evaluation of these efforts, we cannot reflect on the work and make better progress. The bill also sets the key principles that need to be observed in this process, such as promoting efforts to address the root causes of human trafficking, adopting a trauma-informed approach amongst many others.
Devastating and persistent form of violence against Indigenous people. In fact, half of all trafficking victims are Indigenous women, even though they represent only 5% of the population. A recent report highlights the possible links between this high rate of disappearance and murder of Indigenous women and girls and advertisements for sexual services. This is an important angle, but there's a lack of resources and databases to further this investigation. The Missing and Stolen report published in June 2025 refers to the disappearance in October 2024 of Juanita Winnie Migwans while she was walking along a road in Michigan, Ontario. Despite national efforts to find her, she's still missing. drugs gangs in Toronto are suspected of increasingly exploiting Indigenous women in rural communities. Indigenous women and girls are clearly overrepresented among victims, as are migrant worker women and girls who may have a harder time accessing social and medical service due to their unregulated status. If we are serious about ending human trafficking, we must confront the systems that generate profits from sexual exploitation. That means shifting the blame away from those who are exploited and towards those, generally men, who purchase, facilitate, normalize, and benefit from that exploitation. To put an end to human trafficking, we must tackle the demand of sexual services. Recent government efforts to end human trafficking have embraced this logic by prioritizing measures aimed at offenders rather than survivors. However, a closer look at the Federal Actions Plan budgetary allocation reveals a more complex and troubling picture. According to an analysis by a coalition of organizations aiming to end human trafficking in Quebec, over 70% of the federal budget allocated to the government action plan to end human trafficking was used on repression. Enforcement is absolutely necessary, but it cannot be at the expense of the protection and care of victims. When repression absorbs the overwhelming share of resources, survivor protections, long-term housing, trauma-informed care, and economic reintegration risk becoming secondary priorities, according to this Quebec report. So, in conclusion, the intentions behind this bill are praiseworthy, but we must not underestimate the difficulties of reaching consensus between survivors and authorities to move forward. The strategy outlined in the bill is broad, perhaps too broad, given the measures the federal government must take to address this issue. Would it be beneficial to prioritize a few of them? I invite senators to then send this bill to the committee for further study. The stakes are high, and lives are being forever shattered by trafficking. Thank you.